My name is George Talbot. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at the university. I'm delighted to see so many people here this evening to celebrate the exhibition of work by local artist Leonora Carrington, which is going on at Tate, Liverpool at present. The way the evening is going to work, my colleague Roger Shannon is going to introduce our two speakers this evening. Then there will be the conversation, and then after that there will be some questions and answers. The event will be closed formally by the Vice-Chancellor, and you'll be invited to leave through the upper tier of the lecture theatre, and there will be a performance in the atrium below, which you will be able to look at over the balcony, and then there will be a reception. So, without any further ado, let me hand over to Professor Roger Shannon, who will introduce the evening.
Thank you, George. I'm Roger Shannon, and I'm a Professor of Film and Television at the university, and I'm also co-director of the Institute for Creative Enterprise, under whose aegis the event is taking place this evening. And ICE is a cross-discipline forum that connects the university to the creative industries and also the cultural industries of the region. It's so great to see so many people here this evening to celebrate the work of Leonora Carrington, and also to welcome a goodly number of the Carrington family, the extended Carrington family from Lancashire. Leonora was born in 1917, close to this university in Lancashire, and she became a national treasure, as we'll find out more about from our speakers, in Mexico. But she is richly and highly regarded as a very influential and significant figure within the realm of international surrealism. I had the great pleasure of contributing as a special advisor to the exhibition of Leonora's work, which is currently underway at Tate Liverpool until the end of May. It's a marvellous summary of key thematic elements of her work, and this slideshow, which will run throughout the conversation, gives you a glimpse into her work. The partnership between the university and Tate Liverpool kicks off, therefore, most aptly with an exhibition of that most Lancastrian of Mexican artists, that most Mexican of Lancastrian artists. And now to introduce our guest speakers, I'm delighted to welcome to the campus Francesco Manacorda and Joanna Moorhead. Francesco is Artistic Director at Tate Liverpool and a curator of the upcoming Liverpool Biennial in 2016. He's held numerous roles within the world of international contemporary art, curator at London's Barbican Art Gallery, directing Artissima in Turin, and curating national pavilions at the Venice Biennale. And he's taught exhibition history at the Royal College of Art. With his colleague Lauren Barnes at Tate Liverpool, they've created with great imagination the Leonora Carrington exhibition. Joanna Moorhead is a cousin of Leonora's and is an unstinting champion of her work. She's a frequent writer and contributor for The Guardian and The Independent, and has also co-written the book Surreal Friends, which surveys the work of three female surrealists, all friends in exile in Mexico in the 1940s, Leonora Carrington, Remedios Vara, and Katy Horner. She also curated the Surreal Friends exhibition at the Chichester Gallery in 2010. As we'll find out this evening, Joanna met Leonora on a number of occasions, and it was her writing about such visits that first sparked my own interest in her work. So, two fascinating perspectives on the work of Leonora Carrington, and after Joanna and Francesco have been in conversation for a while, we'll open it up for questions from the floor. Thank you, Francesco and Joanna.
Thank you very much, Roger, for this introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. We were just discussing with Joanna in the last few days how to tell a story and how to integrate a story of somebody's life with a story of their work and their artistic practice. And with Leonora, what comes out very often is that the biography is so rich, and the number of events that she went through in her life and the number of people that she met is so interesting and complicated and fascinating that we probably need to give you a glimpse of it. And we will go through the different sort of parts of her life as a way of introduction, and then we'll get into different areas that we've been talking about. But perhaps to start this, I think we can, in a sort of unconventional and unorthodox way, in homage to Leonora herself being unorthodox in everything that she did, we can start from the ends. I was quite keen to ask Joanna to start telling us a little bit how she met Leonora, how you went to Mexico, and how was that encounter in relation to her life, family life, but also your life and your family life.
Well, I had always known that I had a cousin, that there'd been a cousin who had disappeared from my father's family many, many years ago, even many years before I was born, I think 25 years before I was born. And she was a sort of, in my part of the family anyway, a rather shadowy figure. I knew very little about her, and most of what I did know about her was through my grandmother. My grandmother, who I was very close to, was Leonora's friend, and then through this friendship she met and married Leonora's uncle, who became my grandfather. So my grandmother was a woman who very much fitted into the rather upper class world she'd been born into. And so I can see, looking back, that everything she told me about the cousin who disappeared reflected the fact that Leonora had done things that were, in her mind, very, very bad indeed, and not the way you behaved if you'd been born into a certain, into these echelons of society. So I'd known about this cousin, and I knew very little about her. And what my grandmother, the few times she mentioned her, she said that she was that she had run away, and that was obviously very bad. She'd gone away, and she'd become an artist's model, was what she told me. And as a child, I think I heard, probably from my granny, Mexico mentioned. And that's really, really all I knew. It seems strange to say it now because I know so much about her, and I'm a journalist, and I research things, but I never had researched Leonora's work, which seems very strange because there was an exhibition of her work in London in 1992. But in 1992, when I realised I was having a baby in 1992. I was born very early, so I completely missed the exhibition. So I really did not know anything about Leonora Carrington. And then by chance, I was sitting at a dinner party next to a woman who was Mexican and turned out to be an art historian. We started chatting. I knew nothing about Mexico or art. We'd almost finished the very short conversation we were going to have in that case. And I suddenly remembered that there was this cousin, and that there'd been art and there'd been Mexico, and here I was sitting next to this Mexican art historian. So I said to this woman, oh, it was really an afterthought. I mean, I was really turning away to speak to someone else. And then I said to her, I wonder if by any chance you might have heard of my father's cousin. She went to Mexico many years ago. She may be dead by now. Her name was, and I couldn't even remember her name because in our family, Leonora was always called Prim, so I knew she was Prim. I knew her surname all right. And then I remembered it was Leonora Carrington. And I said, Leonora Carrington. And this woman, there are, I don't know how many millions of people there are in Mexico, but, there's an awful lot of them. She must have been very much doubted that she would have ever heard of my father's cousin. But when I said her name, she actually held onto the table and said, I can't believe what who you're asking me about. Leonora Carrington, she's your cousin, you know nothing about her. And I didn't, but that obviously got me very interested. And what I was very interested in particularly was that the story that I then heard from this art historian about this woman who'd become a very successful, very well-known artist in Mexico, and that was set against the legacy that I had picked up anyway in our family, which was very slight. So I Googled her, I found out a lot about her, and then I decided that something about her work really, I think, infected me, and I could see a sort of spirit there, and I just thought I wanted to go and find her. So I did, and my husband, we've got four daughters, some of whom were quite young at the time, was rather shocked when I said I was just going to go to Mexico to look for this cousin. I managed to make contact through the art gallery that represented her work, but I didn't make direct. I hadn't spoken to her until I actually arrived in Mexico, and a cousin who had been to see her on his way through Mexico a few years before was not optimistic about the chances of her welcoming me.
No, I know stories of people trying to see her being rejected. There's a contemporary artist called Lucy Scare who is a very good friend of mine, and has a very similar story because she recently did the film before Leonora died, and she wanted to go and see her, and she went to Mexico and stayed in my flat. I was in London at that stage the night before leaving with a Brompton bike, and she went to Mexico and then went off the plane and went onto the bike and literally went knocking on Leonora's door, and she said no for 3 times until finally she let her do this film of her hands.
That's absolutely. I understand completely that how difficult it was to get into Leonora's place, and it was only with hindsight that I realised how lucky I had been to just be able to go to Mexico and knock on her door. And what was really wonderful about meeting her for the first time was that from the moment she came to the door and opened it, and you can imagine, I'm sure, that I was very, very nervous. I'd gone a very long way on a very small, possibility really. And when she opened the door, I could see, or I felt that she was interested in what I was going to say to her as well. And I think that was how our relationship continued.
Because you introduce yourself as like being part of this family who she had sort of nearly completely, severed links with, apart from her mum, I understand. So you arrived there representing for her the past, right?
Yeah, representing a past that she had said farewell to, really a long time before. But this cousin, who was doubtful about whether she would welcome me, did say that the Moorhead side of our family was the side, because she had remained, as you say, friendly. She'd remained close to her mother as far as she could across these miles.
Yeah. But perhaps we can go in the normal way and start by saying, as Roger said in his introduction, that Leonora was born not very far from here in Chorley, and grew up in Lancashire in quite a complex family. Do you want to tell us more or less what kind of combination of different stories and backgrounds between Ireland and Lancashire and different sort of economic situations as well?
Yeah. Well, I was struck by what Roger, I think it was, said at the beginning there about, I can't tell you how amused Leonora would have been to have heard herself described as a local artist, Leonora Carrington, and to know that her work was here on show at the Tate. That would have really surprised her. But she is indeed a local artist, and she was born, as you say, near Chorley, in a village not far from Chorley, in April 1917, so we're coming up to the 100th anniversary of her birth. Her parents were very different people. Her mother, my great aunt Maury, was the daughter of an Irish doctor from Moat in County Westmeath, and her father, Harold Carrington, was a textile millionaire, and he was a very wealthy and very successful textile magnate. When Leonora was born, they were living in quite a grand house called Westwood. They moved when she was a small child to a house called Crookie, which was a very grand, big Gothic mansion. And a lot of Leonora's work reflects her memories of that house. She was the second child of this couple. Above her was a brother called Pat, and below her were 2 more brothers, Gerard and Arthur. So she was sandwiched in a family of boys. They were extremely well off. They were so well off that they were, I got the impression from the stories she told, that they were almost struggling to keep up with their wealth. They didn't own their houses. They would quickly move to another, even bigger, grander house. And she told me a very funny story, actually, about how she and her mother sometimes used to go around going to sort of jumble sales, looking for paintings of sort of aristocratic-looking people that they could put on their wall, because they had no grand aristocrats. And she remembered that sometimes her mother used to take her to these sales and say, oh, this one looks a bit like us, looks a bit like you, so that there'd be a family resemblance. And then they, so there was definitely an element in that family of kind of nouveau riche and people who had not been born to it, but were quickly, and so she lived in that house until she was about 10 or 11, and then they moved to a house by the sea.
And I suspect that at that time, a family of that sort of wealth and that social position, the separation between the parents and the children would be quite large. And a nanny definitely was there, in fact, and a nanny who was perhaps chosen as coming from Ireland, not by chance, I suspect.
I think that's right, yeah.
But one that, because of the gulf that there was at that age between parent and daughters and sons, I think the nanny played a large role that we can recognise even in the paintings now, I think. Is that?
Yeah, I think it's true that although Leonora was growing up here in Lancashire, the influences of Ireland were very strong in her life. And a lot has been made actually by art historians of the nanny's influence, and I'm sure that it was significant. My understanding is that the nanny actually came from the same part of Ireland. So that's interesting, because that would mean that the, all of the stories would have a very deep basis in that particular part of Ireland. So I think that's how the Irish influence came in. But also, I think that it's significant that, remember I talked about the background of Maury and Harold. They were not people who came from an aristocratic family where they would have been separated much from their parents growing up. So I think actually they were much closer as a family. But she did, from the beginning, or from very early in her life, have a very difficult relationship with her father. And the relationship with her father was to, I would say, dominate her entire life. And at the end of her life, when I was sitting with her in her kitchen in Mexico, we would have conversations sometimes that were still very emotional, really, and raw about a man who had died by then many, many years before.
And this is because, I suppose, without trying to generalize too much, that her father was trying to sort of position her in society through a set of rules that she did not accept, or that she could not see herself fitting into.
That's right.
So that the first part of her life is really marked by this struggle with not very much authority, I think, but more like the sort of we have to do things in a certain way, and these are rules that cannot be questioned. Is that,
yes,
is that your impression?
that's right. My impression is that this was a family that for whom it was important for the parents to fit in to these echelons that they had quickly come into. And I think it's quite a key to understanding Leonora's life, actually, or her work, to realise that she was always an outsider. And she's been painted, I think, wrongly by art historians as coming from an aristocratic family. The irony is that as an aristocrat, she could have been more eccentric. She could have behaved in a more eccentric fashion. Jessica Mitford was a debutante in the same year as her, and Jessica Mitford's book describes how eccentric some of the debutantes were. Leonora couldn't be eccentric because it was very important to her family, to her parents, particularly to her father, that she married well, because that was going to be, that was going to underline their social standing.
There would have been the other way around, like the sons would have been sought after because of the fortune, so she could have married well, as in like married with aristocracy probably, right? Is that,
yes,
is that
I think that's exactly right, yes, yeah.
And she really refused to fit within this plan that her dad had for her.
She refused to fit in with every plan he ever had for her from the very outset.
And
he had many, and from one of his very early plans was to send her. She had a governess until she was about 12 or 13, and then she went away to school, and she didn't like that at all. She went to first one convent school that she was expelled from, and then another convent school that she was also expelled from, and it was because she didn't want to fit into what was obviously a very regimented way of life there. But she felt, she told me a story one day that I think says quite a lot about her, that she, I think, had gone downstairs breakfast or something, and she'd accidentally got the wrong shoes on. So she got non-matching shoes on, and she really had made a mistake. And one of the nuns saw her and said, "Oh, Leonora Carrington, trying so hard to be difficult and different." But she wasn't, you know, she just made a mistake. But she felt that people were always on her case, and wrongly, unfairly.
So I suppose that when you are in this condition, it couldn't have been a sort of better occasion to actually come across the group of the most unconventional and most sort of passionate about turning everything upside down group of intellectuals operating in Europe at that stage. I think that you know, she was in some way nearly primed to rebel, or she was sort of by different circumstances found herself in a situation in which she couldn't have responded more to a group such as the Surrealists, I think.
Yes,
and I seem to remember, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it was her mother that introduced us to Surrealism by just like buying her a book or showing her a book of painting. Is that?
Well, it was the after school she went to London, and when she was 17 she came out as a debutante, so she was a part of this social world of London, and she came out, she was in other words, was presented at court, in the last court of King George V in 1935. Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first international surrealist exhibition was in London in 1936.
Yes,
the London one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So by then, she had come out, surprisingly enough, not had any offers of marriage, or not any that she told me about or was going to take up anyway, considering, yes. And she'd persuaded her parents to let her stay in London and go to art school. So there she was in London, and in 1936 there was the International Exhibition of Surrealism. Unfortunately, it's often said in the books that she went to that show, but she couldn't remember having been there, actually. And I think it's unlikely that she went to it. But her mother did buy her Herbert Reed's book, which was, I think, linked to that exhibition. And that book certainly was about the work of all the surrealists. And I think a very important moment for Leonora, and I don't know whether, I think actually she did see it in that book of Herbert Reed's. She saw a painting by Max Ernst. Yeah, and I think it was Two Children Are Threatened by a Nightingale. Is that the name of the painting? Yeah. I've actually seen it in New York now. And she saw this painting, and she immediately recognised what it had to say. And one of the things she often said was that she knew Max already, because when she saw that piece of work, and I've looked at that it's not exactly a painting, I mean something, it's, you know, whatever you call it when something comes out of the painting.
Sort of relief painting or sculpture painting,
yeah. And I've tried to work out what it was that she saw in that.
Well, I guess it was a mix of combining the real world with the fantasy world, which was something that she already was trying to do with her arts, even the early stage one, but also through writing, which is very important as well.
Yeah.
As a way of encouraging imagination, and a mix between the imagination and her experience was what she was trying to do in a sort of proto-surrealist way. So I guess that she recognized what a way of thinking and a way of working.
Yes, the thing that I wonder about as well in that painting, which as I remember shows, you know, two children being threatened by a nightingale, is that in the most ordinary of situations, or in a scene that appears to be safe, that there's danger. And I think that says something about Leonora's situation as well. We're talking, don't forget, in the 1930s about a country that was in the middle of the biggest depression there's ever been. And Leonora Carrington was one of the richest young women, luckiest, I should say, young women alive, really. But that situation did not, for her, necessarily represent safety. Happiness, safety, you know, it wasn't, she didn't see that as fortune, good fortune. And I think that that's one of the big messages that I think that she has to convey through her work, that, you know, what we do with our lives, that's really the right thing to do is more important than, you know, being lucky enough to have everything that we want. It would have enslaved her. It would have kept, you know, it wouldn't have given her the opportunities that she wanted. So
and in that situation, she was quite lucky, because as essentially she was going to private classes of painting by a French painter, and there she met Ursula Goldfinger, who was married to Goldfinger, the architect, who has sort of brought modernism in London, Tredish House and the house in Hampstead and a few other iconic buildings.
As well as, of course, providing the character for
James Bond. Yes,
absolutely,
yes. And she was invited to a dinner by Ursula, saying, you know, come for dinner to our house. There's a friend staying, and you'll find interesting meeting this person. And this person was, in fact, Max Ernst.
That's right. Yeah.
And in some way, I think within the biography of Leonora, this is nearly like a sort of a being born again. It's like a moment in which her whole life changes, right?
Yeah.
And the consequences of that evening in which she meets Max Ernst are quite far-fetched and bring her across continents. In fact.
That's right.
Did she ever talk to you about meeting Max? Just for those who might not know, Max Ernst is, as we were sort of discussing, is probably one of the most important painters of the Surrealist group. The Surrealist group is quite a large one. It involves writers, poets, and painters, and sculptors, or even the inventor of conceptual arts, Marcel Duchamp, is affiliated to this group. But Max was definitely, especially at that stage, one of the sort of most prominent artists of the group. But going back, what did she say about that meeting?
She remembered, in fact, I visited the flat in High Point House, which is where the Goldfingers were living at the time in Hampstead. So I can imagine exactly the scene, and I've seen the space where this dinner party was. And she remembered meeting him, and they were both poured glasses of champagne, and the champagne started to bubble up over the glass, and Max put his finger, you know that thing of putting your finger into a gas fizzy drink, and the bubbles going down. Max put his finger into the drink, and she copied him, and their eyes met across this table, and they were lovers very soon after. Of course, Max was not the husband or the partner who Leonora's parents had in mind in any way. The one thing he had going for him actually was that he was a Catholic, but in every other way, I'm afraid. And the Catholicism didn't go too far because he was twice married. He was on his second wife, and he had a child, and he was 46. He wasn't very different in age, actually, from Leonora's father. I think he was a little slightly younger, but not very much. So he didn't tick any of the boxes. But he did represent, I mean, I don't know particularly just about that night, but very quickly she was introduced to his friends, first in this country and then in Paris, which is the moment when she left England, our family, and eloped effectively to Paris. That came later in the year. So we're in 1937 now. This meeting was in the spring of 1937. The reason Max was over in London was that he had a show on himself in London. So through him, she got to know, first of all, the British Surrealists, who are not a very big band, but there were a few of them, particularly Roland Penrose and Lee Miller, who actually Lee Miller, the photographer, and Roland Penrose, who's the biographer of Picasso.
They were very active in bringing the French surrealists into holidays. There's a lot of pictures by Lee Miller, in fact, with Leonora and a group of surrealists that were staying in Cornwall.
That's right.
Or somewhere else. I cannot
Yes, no, it was Cornwall. Well, there was a reason for the Cornwall holiday. This holiday that they had in Cornwall was supposed to be the biggest gathering there ever was of British surrealists. And the holiday came about because Leonora's father was immediately very unhappy about his daughter being with this artist, Max Ernst. So he appears to have tried to, I don't know about, get him arrested or get him sent back anyway possibly to Germany. He was trying to do whatever he could anyway to upset the plans of these these lovers. And he Roland Penrose, who Max Ernst was staying with, heard about these plans and said, I think we should get Max out of London. So he took Max and Leonora and Lee Miller down to his brother's house, which is in Falmouth, and they basically hid there for several weeks. And obviously in those days, Cornwall was a very long way from London. And many other artists came to visit them while they were there, including Henry Moore. Actually went for lunch, I think, one day. And they sent a postcard to Picasso in Paris and said, we're all having a lovely holiday in Cornwall. Yeah.
And of course, moving to Paris in 1937 was probably equivalent to moving to the center of the visual art world at that stage, because there was Surrealism, there was Dada, Picasso was living there. So anyone who would have been introduced by Max Ernst to his group of friends would have met, half of the art historical milieu that is now in 3 floors of the Guggenheim and many galleries across the world in some way. So I think that she arrived in Paris and then she met a variety of people and immediately participated, because Surrealists immediately embraced her as like an absolute muse, and Breton called her the sort of femme enfant, no? The woman child, which I'm sure she wasn't probably particularly happy with, but she became like the absolute darling of the whole group, and participated in all the landmark exhibitions. The first one being in '38, in which the Surrealists had like an entire gallery completely into darkness. Man Ray decided that all the visitors would have to go around with like torches to see the paintings. There was the famous installation of Marcel Duchamp that had like coal sacks on the ceiling, and so it was a complete. It was like walking into a dream. It was a complete madness.
Taxis with the rain coming in.
Yes, Dali did like a taxi with rain that would be inside the taxi. The taxi driver was a skull with a sort of the jaws of a shark as like a sort of mask in the face of the mannequin.
These surrealist exhibitions were full of strange goings on, though, because the one the previous summer, just to go back that quickly, the 36 one, of course, was the time when Salvador Dali got stuck inside a diver's helmet, and it was only by chance that somebody realised he was suffocating, and they had to get him out. He was like, as I am now, speaking to an audience, and then they realised he hadn't said much for a few minutes, and he was actually dying inside. It was Edward James who got him out.
Yeah.
He was the great patron of Surrealism.
And of Leonora in particular.
And of Leonora, so he comes into her story as well.
Just again, like doing a cavalcade towards getting to Mexico, if we might get into that, because it's so fascinating that it's difficult. Then after these years of the maximum exposure to art history that people would have been able to have in the 1930s, she moved into a little village, Saint-Martin-d'Ardèche, with Max. And she bought a house, which they transformed into a sort of total work of art together. I think there's several murals. All the sort of furniture was sort of either decorated or even made by them. And there's sculptures that are integrated in the walls of the garden or of the house. So they sort of lived the idyllic moment there with the impending war coming in. So Max being a German, that was quite a problem.
That's right.
France.
Yeah, and I've been to that house.
I
have been inside that house. Yes, it's very difficult to get into there. But when I said I was Leonora's cousin, and she was still alive at the time, they said I could go in and see it. So this was Leonora's idyllic, the most idyllic time of her life, really. And she, by the time I met her, she would still talk about that summer, and she remembered it as a wonderful time, because she'd managed to do what she'd always wanted to do, really, which was get herself away from her family and away from England, because she'd found that suffocating as well. And she'd found herself, first of all, as Francesco says, in the kind of extraordinary experience of Paris and the mature period of Surrealism as well. So Surrealism was well on into its the best moment, with the best people. And then Max and Leonora actually left Paris, partly because Max had a row with Breton, but also because Max's current wife was living in Paris and obviously a bit unhappy about him having turned up with his new lover, and she made quite a lot of scenes. Surrealism was played out, wasn't it, in the cafes of Paris, and the cafe they went to, his wife, who I think was called Mary Berth, realised quite quickly where they were, and there were quite a lot of rows where plates and glasses were thrown, and then Max decided they should go, and so they went to the south of France to this farmhouse, and they stayed there for a year or so, and then indeed the war came, and this was Vichy France, and Max was an enemy alien because it was Vichy France and he was German, so he was interned and then released and then taken away again, and you can imagine that because they were in that area, Leonora was very isolated. They were both very isolated, but then with him gone, she was completely on her own, and she was still a very young woman. I've got daughters now of that age, and I wouldn't be very happy. I can really identify with Leonora's mother. If one of my daughters was now all on her own, and a war was separating us, and it was very difficult for her. When I went to that house, it was an extraordinary experience. Actually, it was as if Leonora had just left. There were her books in the bookcase. There was the bed where they were, and there was a desk with letters from her mother, and they were very, very affecting letters because I could so identify with Maury. She was terrified. Her only daughter was cut off by a war. And indeed, Maury was right to be so worried about her daughter because, it didn't go well for Leonora. And she ended up having a breakdown. And a friend happened to be passing through that area of France, a girlfriend called Catherine Yarrow, who is herself an artist, a ceramics artist, became an artist. And Catherine said, "I can't leave you here." And she took her with her in her car, which Leonora used to say the car was about as big as the coffee table. So a very small car, and they went over the Pyrenees to Spain. But I think that Leonora always regretted having left because, of course, Max was in...
Max was nowhere to be found.
Well, Max was in prison, you see.
Yeah,
he was interned at the time.
Go and visit, right? Because it was
not at that point.
Camp, not a German one, but it was. It was definitely a place where she couldn't reach him.
No.
And she thought that she had lost him forever. Right? That's probably what she felt.
Yes, and I don't I think the reason why she left, why she sold the house, was actually because they had debts in the town. So, I mean, sometimes, again, this has been painted by art history that she was doing it to, in some way, wound Max. But I think it was actually because she was a woman of, great honour, and she wouldn't want to leave the town if she owed money. So I think she sold the house so she could repay their debts. However, what happened to Max was that he was released, and when he came back to the village to look for Leonora, she wasn't there. And the house was sold, so that was a very big blow to him, of course. But she, meanwhile, had got into Spain. Yeah. They went to Madrid. She stayed with friends of the family, which must indicate what a difficult situation she was in, I think. That, of course, also enabled her father to have some means of communication indirectly, I think, to the people who were looking after her in Madrid. But she had another more serious breakdown in Madrid, and those friends, on the pretext of taking her for a day out by the sea, took her to an asylum in Santander in Spain, and she spent a few months then in that asylum, and that was a very significant moment in her life, and her paintings definitely, you see in her work at various periods, you see her work reflecting right through her life, I think, the difficulty. She couldn't talk about that even in her 90s. No, she couldn't talk about what had happened to her.
And in some way, that's, as I said earlier, it's probably another moment in which such a massive change in her life means that she had to reinvent herself, and she changed, not personality, but like she became somebody else, right?
Yeah.
Because first of all, because she had to sort of go down below, as she put it in one of her books describing precisely that experience. She sort of went into the underground and then had to re-emerge and to be reborn, like a sort of a Persephone myth, kind of being born again. But that had consequences because essentially she tried to escape from her family who was trying to take her back. And this migration between countries was, again, like quite symbolic of like this sort of changes in her life. And eventually she found an escape by meeting meeting a diplomat and a poet, a Mexican diplomat and poet who proposed marriage, proposed themselves as wanting to marry her. And she saw that as a way of, well, fine, that's a way out of Europe, which was probably the way of sort of running away from the first life, but also the second life and the pain that had caused, like losing Max. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's broadly true, and I think she was very keen to get away from Europe, from the war, obviously, and also from her. She was very fond of saying, I mean, it's a very hard thing to say. I was always shocked, by the way, about the way she reflected on our family, and I was forever telling her, you know, or saying, do you really feel like that? But she was adamant she did. That she used to say that she was trying to get away from both Hitler and her family, but of the two, her family was the most important to get away from. But anyway, so she made it.
Story which I think is completely unsubstantiated, that her family sent a submarine to rescue
Yes,
her.
it wasn't a submarine, it was a warship, but the family nanny, well, they didn't send the warship, I think they got a passage on the warship for the nanny. And she wasn't happy with that. Well, she was very fond of her nanny, but she was always, and she did really always remember this, she was very unhappy that the nanny came and not her parents, but I don't know how easy it would have been for her parents to go, but I suppose, but anyway, she felt that they should have gone, and her nanny didn't speak any Spanish either. She always said that, goodness knows what this nanny, she would never have been abroad before, nanny, so this will be her only experience. She'd known Ireland, she'd known Lancashire, and then suddenly she found herself in an asylum in northern Spain. But anyway, she was sent home. Leonora sent her home on her own, and I think that's a very significant moment in her story, because it seems to me that, you know, that was her family holding out an olive branch, really, and saying, come home. And yes, she didn't like it was the nanny, but, you know, she could have gone back to this comfortable life. And there she was, in a war, facing goodness knows what, but, you know, imprisonment or death herself. You know, she was in a very dangerous situation. She didn't have any money, she didn't have any friends, she didn't have a lover anymore, and she said no to the return to everything she'd left behind. And that shows her will to get out of this, of what she saw as a claustrophobic environment and become the woman she wanted to be. And so that's what she, as you say, she met this Mexican diplomat. He asked her to marry him. They were married in Lisbon. They married in Lisbon.
He was in the embassy in Lisbon, or anyway.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. I think they went there together, and then they married there, and then they had a few weeks waiting for a boat to take them across the Atlantic.
And the most extraordinary thing happened.
An extraordinary thing happened. Yes.
Huge Tate.
Which was that she went out one day, Leonora went out one day to the market, and she saw a figure she knew very well, and that figure was Max Ernst. He had got away from his prison. He'd gone back to the village. He'd discovered that she'd gone and that she'd sold the house. He'd been obviously extremely upset by that, but he'd left eventually the village, and he'd travelled to Marseille, which is where the poet, the artists and writers were gathering in the hope of getting a passage across to America. And somewhere along that journey, I think on his way to Marseille, he had met Peggy Guggenheim, the art patron, and she had fallen in love with Max. Peggy had fallen in love with Max. I'm pretty certain that Max had not fallen in love with Peggy, but I think he
saw an escape as well.
He was smart enough to realise that he wasn't going to turn down Peggy getting him away. Yeah. So Peggy was actually out of Lisbon at the time when Leonora and Max met, and Peggy in her autobiography describes the moment when she arrived back in Lisbon and Max met her from the train, and he told her at the railway station, it was almost the first thing he said to her when she got off the train. He said, an amazing thing's happened. I've met Leonora, she's here in Lisbon, and Peggy says in her book, I felt the dagger go in my heart, because she knew that Max loved Leonora.
Although they never go back together in those conditions, and not even when both of them in a sort of parallel kind of mood of transport, like one with the Peggy Guggenheim plane and another one on a boat with a Mexican diplomat. But they both went to New York and lived in the same city again for a couple of years, where essentially the exact same group of surrealists and modernists that was in Paris, that included, you know, from Breton, Duchamp, Man Ray, but also Mondrian, for example, and other incredibly important artists working on the first half of the 20th century were living pretty much all gathered around the gallery of Peggy Guggenheim, which at that stage it was called the Art of the 20th century.
Yes.
But they one carried on being with Peggy, and the other one carried on being with Renato Leduc, who was the Mexican diplomat.
Although, yes, and another thing Peggy says in her autobiography is how very relieved she was when Leonora left New York after this period.
Did you ever discuss this with Leonora, that particular period of New York and this sort of transitional moment in which Max is in the same city but sort of not available to her or perhaps not wanted?
I mean, I don't think that she was ever hankering after she told me that, you know, when they were in Lisbon, it was very obvious that they could not reignite their affair. They were both there with effectively their passports out. They couldn't muck up those arrangements. When they got to New York, Leonora was a woman who would not have been happy, I don't think. You know, well, I was going to say, I don't know whether she would have been happy to have been with Max because he was then Peggy's partner. But I also think actually she was very happy with Renato Leduc for a few years. I mean, she did, when they then travelled to Mexico together, Leonora and Renato, her husband, and they were married for maybe a couple of years in Mexico, and then they did separate. But it was a very amicable separation, and I actually think they had quite a for what was largely a marriage of convenience. I think they were quite happy for a couple of years.
And just to get to the sort of final country, as you said, like they moved to Mexico. Renato and Leonora moved to Mexico, and eventually they split up. And Leonora married an Hungarian photographer called Cheeky Weiss. But essentially, Leonora found herself again in probably the furthest away from the sort of orthodox surrealism. But in Mexico, there was a group of people that included Trotsky, it included Buñuel, it included all sorts of other emigre artists those who probably fitted less with what Breton came to create as a sort of nearly dogmatic religion. Like, and that's probably the reason why Max Ernst had an altercation with him, is that Breton became a pope and surrealism became a set of rules, and we know how Leonora reacts to a set of rules, although you're describing her as, you know, being quite proper and not really wanting to hurt other people. But
I think that was an emotional thing, though. I don't think it was to do with rules.
Yeah,
I think it was to do with,
It's like, it's probably empathy or identification rather than like, you don't do that because that's not to be done. It's like the Ten Commandments.
That's not why she wouldn't do anything, but she would never want to, she wouldn't want to hurt people. She could be cutting, and she could be, but you're right, she used to call, on the subject of Breton, she used to call him the headmaster, which does sum up, and you're exactly right, I think, about him and Max.
I think we'll have to wrap up quite soon, but you'll see that we only have halfway through her life, because you know, she lived another.
We should quickly skip through the next 60 years then, shouldn't we?
But I think what we need to say here is that she arrived into what Breton called like the most surrealist of countries, and that was probably an important place for her, because she got to a country which like had really no separation between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It didn't have a separation between fantasy and reality, and magic and the syncretism of religion was rule of the day. You would go at a market and meet a magician who could tell you your future, or you could go to a Catholic church and find out rituals which weren't particularly Catholic, I think. Did you discuss with her like how and why she found that Mexico was a home, spiritual home, probably not where she was born, but
I think it was an extraordinarily happy chance that Mexico was the country where she ended up, because I think she must have, because I think that we haven't talked very much about surrealism as a movement, I guess, but I think that she was instinctively a surrealist. she didn't. It was just came from inside her. And Mexico is a country. I think Breton was right.
Yeah.
If any country, you know, there's a lot of the surreal in Mexico. And I think it also connected very much to her Irish past as well, because there are connections between Mexico, I think, culture and
yeah, well, mythology and storytelling, like between the sort of Celtic tradition of not just fairy tales, but also the mythological part, and the way that integration between the sort of Mayan and the sort of way that Catholicism and other kind of myth have been embraced by Mexico was pretty similar, I think.
And another Catholic country,
exactly.
as you say.
And, and one that both had like Catholic and pre-Catholic integrated in a pretty incredible way.
And the thing I often think about what happened to her when she got to Mexico is that I don't think, I mean, you're the art historian here, but I don't think that much of her art is about Mexico.
No.
Despite the fact that she then spends the next 60 years, so Mexico is the place, you know, where she creates her art, but her art is not very much about Mexico. It's much more about Lancashire and about Ireland and about England, and it has echoes from all over the place, but, you know, in the historically it's from her past.
I think Roger is signaling to us that we need to open up to the audience and
Well, I've been listening there, and I could listen to you for hours talking about Leonora, but I wanted to give yourselves the opportunity to ask some questions of Francesco and Joanna about Leonora Carrington, and I suppose what we could call our re-Lancastrianation of Leonora, but bringing her back to Lancashire, because she's been known, obviously, as you've been discussing, she was familiar with the London surrealist art scene in the 30s, and then in Paris, and then in Mexico, and this is an opportunity to talk about her life in Lancashire. So we've got some roving mics. So if you could indicate anyone who would like to ask a question, then I'll try and move it along as quickly as I can. But there's a question in the middle there. And who else has got that?
Hello. Hi, Francesco. We've met before. Joanna, nice to see you. I think that was one of the most interesting and fascinating and enjoyable. We could have gone on for ages listening to you both. So thank you for that. But Joanna, I want to ask you a question. You obviously, as a family, had the artworks hanging around for absolutely years. What were you all thinking?
Do you mean the art
before you realised?
The art that Leonora had left when
Yes,
she
yes.
well, remember she left when she was 20. So you know, she'd begun. She always drew. Drawing was the first thing she remembered doing. But obviously her work, you know, her mature work will be after. Really, I think her the work, the art historically begins when she's in Paris. But she did leave some work from that early period, and indeed it's in the show at the Tate now. And there are somewhere in the audience there's a cousin of mine who's lent some work, so she'll know better than me.
Yes, few lenders from the family, and it's right to say that that in fact I think there would be within the family, even historically, there wouldn't have been many works post Max Ernst, let's call them, right? I think she sent few to her mother, but then they sort of they passed hands quite a few years ago, I think. So,
yeah, so including the painting you've got actually.
Exactly, the St. Anthony. But do you remember seeing any work in?
No, but I know that work did hang in the house of.
So when you reported to the Mexican art historian with whom you had dinner, you hadn't seen. You knew about it, but you hadn't seen any work.
No, I had not seen any work at all. No, and it was Googling her work that night that made me so interested in her. Yeah, so I think I think it would be true to say that people who are now dead would be very surprised to know that painting we're talking about was sold at auction in New York last year for $2.5 million US. there would have been a lot of surprised faces around the table in Crookie Hall or Hazelwood if that had been known a few decades ago.
And just to follow on from what Francesco was saying, yes, there are examples of Leonora's work which are on show in the Tate exhibition, and some of that material has been sourced from Holland and from Lancaster. There's Helen Carrington and Fiona Carrington in the audience this evening, and work by Leonora was kindly allowed to be shown.
Actually, on view now. These are the works that you're talking about.
Yeah. So I think there's a question there. Is there one at the back? Yeah, one. Can we get the mic along?
It's not much to do with Lancashire, but did she say much on her relationship with Remedios Varo while she was in Mexico? Because their work's remarkably similar.
Sorry, I didn't
Remedios,
Could you say
Remedios Varo?
Yeah, did she say much about it?
About her relationship with Remedios Varo, yes.
Yeah. And Cathy Orner, perhaps. I mean, you did a show about the three of them, and I think it's a central element.
Yeah, it was. It was a very big relationship in Leonora's life. So when she arrived in Mexico, particularly after she split up from her husband Renato, she was again alone. And the people she gravitated towards were a small group of émigré artists from Europe who, like her, had been thrown out of Europe by the war. And there were two central figures. There were many in that group, but there were two central figures with whom she really formed a big relationship. And one was, as you rightly say, the Spanish artist Remedios Varo, and the other was a Hungarian photographer called Tate Horner. And they became very close, and she did talk a lot about Remedios. Remedios died, I don't know how much I'm guessing you know quite a lot about Remedios Varo.
I've seen a few of her works, not enough though, about the relationship between them.
She died much earlier than Leonora. I mean, she died in the 60s, in the early 60s. She died very young. But one of the things I think is very interesting about Leonora's work is that having, in the early part of her life, been part of this art movement which was very male, very masculine, and dominated by older men, in Mexico, she gathers around herself or makes herself part of a group that is other women. Remedios and Tate, and there were others as well. Frida Kahlo was, of course, another woman artist in Mexico at the time, although she didn't think much of the European artists like Leonora, although she and Leonora got on okay. But I think it's interesting that Leonora's work, her mature work, the work in Mexico, the wellspring, or what's behind it, is this very close relationship. And her work in Mexico, you know, these weren't friendships that were just tangential to the rest of her life. She sat around the same kitchen table where I spent many, many hours with her, with Remedios and with Tate and with the other artists, and they talked and they talked and they talked about what they were reading, about the influences, what was going on in Mexico, and those were how that formed the basis of the paintings. And I think if you know Remedios Varo's work, you will see that there are some paintings where you see the same scene. Leonora's painting it, and then Remedios is painting it. It was a very, very close friendship. She was devastated when Remedios died.
She also wrote a book about the Young Trumpets, which represents a group of women in later age, which I think was very much sort of time-traveling experience of that relationship, right? Is that?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, it's an interesting. We haven't talked at all, of course, about the fact that as well as a painter, she was painting. She's also writing, and she wrote a series of short stories way back when she was in Paris, in fact, and Max Ernst illustrated them. And then she wrote The Hearing Trumpet, I think, when she was in her 50s. It was published when she was in her 70s, but I think it was written when she was in her 50s. And what's interesting about The Hearing Trumpet, which is indeed about the lives of a group of women who are very elderly, is that she the thing I always thought was that she was projecting herself into a future that very much became the future she had. So when I knew her in her 90s, she was living, I mean, obviously, if you know the work, The Hearing Trumpet, she wasn't living in a zany old people's home that was kind of a bit like a convent, medieval convent. She wasn't living there. She was just living in the same house. But what was going on, the magic, was very like being in the Hearing Trumpet.
Hello. I wonder if either of you could tell us a little bit about Leonora Carrington's interest in theatre. The image that's appeared on the screen several times this evening from Penelope looks fascinating, but there's also, of course, her interest in Shakespeare. And I wonder if you could perhaps illuminate her interest in Shakespeare in particular, please.
Yeah, well, I can explain a bit of the images, which are some images from the exhibition at Tate. And when we started doing the show, I found very fascinating what we just said, that Leonora was not just a painter, but also a writer. But then the more you investigate into her life, and the more you understand that she was really like a Renaissance artist. She really got herself involved in a variety of disciplines, and therefore also in dialogue with Roger, who came from a film angle, and there are several sort of tangential and less tangential relations to film. She acted in a short film with Buñuel. She designed, she did art director for another film that is part of the exhibition. But theatre was also quite prominent because Penelope is a play that she wrote, and it's a story which is also the subject of a painting, the Oval Lady, that is rotating in this presentation. If it comes up while I speak, I'll point out. That particular occasion was an occasion in which the legendary theatre director and film director Alejandro Jodorowsky, who was he's a Mexican still living and knew Leonora, decided to represent this play. So he was the theatre director who worked with Leonora on representing this text that she had written. And Leonora was involved in setting up the costumes and all the set design. So it was this strange collaboration, which wasn't an easy one. And in fact, they stopped talking after that particular episode. And Jodorowsky even talks about it in his book, describing how he met Leonora. Now they stopped talking as probably a sort of Jodorowsky's ego was pretty big, and Leonora couldn't possibly cope with it, I think. But that's the first time that she got involved with theatre, and I think she really, I imagine that she really could see the potential of that particular artistic medium, because it was conjuring up what she tried to do between the images in her painting and the words in her story. So she could really represent dreams and put them in front of people. And I guess that was the connection with Shakespeare as well, and how she got involved in doing the stage design and the costume design for a variety of plays was probably linked with this migration between reality and super reality, as surrealism could be very sort of concisely described, that she was fascinated by, I think. I don't know if you have any...
I think, well, the only thing I would say is that I think she's also, she is an artist who, she wasn't a career artist. She wasn't looking for a career. We used to talk sometimes about artists of today, you know, artists who are very wealthy and whose careers have been, you know, a conventional career as an artist today. That wasn't Leonora at all. She followed her heart. I mean, the whole story I've told, you know, that we've talked about, and so artistically, I think she followed her heart as well. And there are also tapestries in Francesco's show. So, you know, she had a few years when she made tapestries. She had those few years in theatre, doing her set designs. She had her years writing, or her time writing. So she would follow her heart and her dreams and do what seemed right. When I knew her, she was the only what work she was doing was sculpture, because she couldn't really see to paint anymore.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, it's interesting you said about Marion Leatherby and the hearing trumpet sort of being like a projected, you know, really what she was going to be like in her 90s. And one thing that Marion Leatherby, you know, one of the things she says is she imagines Lancashire. She goes into a doze, sitting on a bench, and imagines herself in Lancashire, even though she's in the middle of Mexico, and says, I could have gone back. Why didn't I go back? And I wondered, I kind of cheekily want to ask you sort of two questions which are connected, because whether she ever spoke to you about a desire to come back to this area, and also the kind of mystery as to how it is that somebody with such a prodigiously long and productive artistic life is virtually unknown here as an artist. And do you think it's connected to the fact that she did not come back?
Well, if I start with that one,
Yeah.
The thing I sometimes say to people is, if you could imagine working as an artist and doing everything you could to ensure that your work had as little chance as possible of being successful in a conventional way, Leonora did it. So don't be born in one country and go and live in another country, but make your art about the first country and then make sure it's sold in New York in the Latin American sales. Because the people who go to the Latin American sales don't understand this art, or that's my interpretation of it anyway. So she doesn't belong. There's nowhere she obviously belongs as an artist, and that's a problem for an artist in terms of selling and becoming known. If you compare her with Frida Kahlo, who, as I've mentioned, she knew, Frida did everything right to become the huge, famous artist she is today. Her paintings are very accessible, very clear. They're all, they're all about her story. She's been well documented from her youth. She stayed in the same place. Everything Frida did is different actually from Leonora. And she, I mean, it wouldn't be true to say that she went out of her way literally to not publicise her work, but we used to have a bit of a joke, or at least I used to laugh at it. I don't know if she particularly got it, but sometimes we'd be sitting in our kitchen and the phone would ring and it would be a journalist. She'd, I never speak to journalists, you know. And I said, do you not remember what I do? And she did know what I did because she was a big fan of The Guardian, which is the newspaper I write for. But she didn't go out of her way to talk to journalists, or she just didn't do any of the things, you know, that help you on your way. Because that really isn't what she was after. She was, she was trying to express the ideas inside herself. She only had one ambition in life, and that was to be true to herself. And she always used to say, be false to your own self, be true, and you're false to nobody. And that was her absolute guiding principle. That's what she was trying to do. So she wasn't trying to become a famous artist at all. And I think that's got to be part of the reason. And the other question, I mean, she did return to England. She did return to this area 2 or 3 times in her life, and the most in the 50s. I think she was here a couple of times, and in the 1970s she would have returned to the Isle of Man anyway for her mother's funeral, and I think she may have come back one more time with Edward James and gone to Scotland. So she did come back to this country. And I was always trying to get her to admit that she wished she'd come home, but she never ever would. I think that, well, by the time I knew her, I think she'd just gone, you know, it was all a very, very long time ago. And she was, where she was going when I knew her, this is another whole area, was that she was heading towards the final frontier that we all head towards, which is death. That's where she was going, and a lot of the conversations we had were about that, were about the fact that she was going to die. And one of the things that was, because she was, you know, in her late 80s, she died aged 94. And one of the things that I think was that I found very interesting was that her work is very much about moving from the connections in life and moving from one area to another and from one place to another, frontiers between worlds. Well, this was the final frontier. And she was very unsure about it, and that's very interesting. And she was aware that there was an irony in being unsure about it, and we used to talk about that a lot.
So I suppose so Edge Hill University in 1970 was a very, 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 very Tate Liverpool together have brought Leonora Carrington back to Lancashire, I think, with the exhibition. But I think we're going to have to wrap up shortly, and the entertainment hasn't finished yet, because when you leave the hall, and if most of you could leave by the exit at the back, we have a dance piece in the atrium for your entertainment. It's called Imaginarium. It's been devised and it will be performed by colleagues of mine in the Performing Arts Department, Michelle Mann and James Hewison. And it's called Imaginarium, and it's been devised after a residency that they did at Crookie Hall, which was the childhood home of Leonora Carrington. And they have been inspired by her work to develop this piece. It's been performed during the exhibition at Tate Liverpool, and I think its next show is on the 3rd of May, which is a Sunday, this coming weekend. But before you leave, I'd just like to welcome John Cater.
Just a very quick thank you from myself. First of all, to all of you for coming this evening. There's never a show without an audience. And secondly, obviously, an enormous thank you to the person who's provided the inspiration for this evening. Obviously, isn't with us, but actually, as we look at the range of images across a whole range of media, and we get a real sense of what an incredibly talented woman your cousin clearly was. But also, actually, it's not just the images which bring it to life as well. It's actually having two people with such knowledge and such expertise about someone whose life has not been perhaps fully explored in this country until perhaps Joanna's work on the Surrealists, and I know that I'm going to go away, and in my job we spend an awful lot of time reading, but it's something that will go with me on holiday because I look forward to reading that. And also, of course, for those who haven't been down to the Tate, the exhibition runs, and if you don't know by now, you know that it runs until the 31st of May. Actually, you also know by now that actually, given the fact I'm between the ages of 7 and 70, I'm clearly unreliable. And just to demonstrate our fallibility, we've been told twice now that everyone should exit by the back. I actually received a note crept in from the side from actually the two people who are dancing, and they would actually like an audience which splits between the balcony and the stalls. So if you wish to go out of the back, if you're out the back, out of the front, you're out the front, we're delighted to have you here. We hope you both enjoy the dance piece from our colleagues. We hope you come back to the university, and also actually we hope you join us for some catering and drink or two afterwards. So thank you very much. And what I'd like to do in traditional form is to really thank two people who've really made